A sudden shift in diplomatic channels was detected in these hours, one that most observers were not anticipating. According to sources within the network of foreign affairs monitoring, unusual movements of high-level envoys were recorded traveling toward a neutral European state, a location typically reserved for confidential discussions far from the public eye. Official statements remained scarce, citing only routine engagements, but the pattern of arrivals and discreet accommodations hints at something far more consequential. In expert circles, speculation is mounting that these gatherings could represent the opening of a previously undisclosed dialogue aimed at resolving a long-standing geopolitical impasse. By midday, the intensity of logistical coordination became more evident. Sources familiar with security arrangements report that transport corridors and communication lines were adjusted in real time, ensuring minimal exposure to surveillance and media detection. On the surface, these measures appear procedural, yet analysts note the precision and synchronization suggest a premeditated strategy rather than routine protocol. Meanwhile, official channels maintain silence, offering only generalized reassurances that all foreign delegations are in transit for regular consultations. However, behind this veneer, intelligence indicates that multiple parties are engaged simultaneously, with overlapping agendas and sensitive negotiations proceeding without public awareness. At this point in the day, the composition of the participants is itself revealing. Individuals known for their influence over economic and military policymaking are arriving alongside lesser-known technical advisors. Sources say that each envoy's itinerary is tightly controlled, with bilateral and multilateral meetings carefully segmented. In the analytical community, this has prompted a debate. The presence of senior economic policymakers implies that the discussions may extend beyond mere political settlements into financial frameworks and resource allocations, potentially redefining regional influence. Officially, the host country has declined to confirm any meetings, stating only that international dialogues are ongoing under standard diplomatic arrangements. But insiders emphasize that standard procedures rarely involve this level of coordination and secrecy. In these hours, communication patterns further underscore the unusual nature of the day. Certain encrypted channels, typically reserved for urgent policy exchanges, have seen activity spikes exceeding normal operational thresholds. Analysts monitoring these patterns interpret the signals as indicative of preparatory work for agreements that require immediate and confidential handling. The timing aligns with multiple high-level arrivals, suggesting that both the content and sequence of discussions are being carefully orchestrated. While public reports maintain a neutral tone, emphasizing routine diplomacy, the underlying data points to an event that, if confirmed, could alter the regional balance of influence and open pathways for outcomes long considered unattainable. Yet the full scope remains obscured. The veil of neutrality maintained by the host country complicates direct observation, and only fragments of information trickle outward. Some sources, speaking off the record, indicate that the discussions are not merely bilateral but involve a delicate triangulation of interests from multiple stakeholders, each with divergent objectives and non-public priorities. Early signals suggest that proposals are being tabled and considered in isolation, with contingencies prepared for rapid shifts in stance. To outside observers, the environment appears calm, almost procedural. To those monitoring from within the intelligence and diplomatic network, the day is unfolding with quiet but significant turbulence, as each decision, each movement, carries potential ramifications far beyond the immediate venue. On the surface, the afternoon's calm belies a tension that is palpable only to those positioned within the network of observation. Analysts note the rare convergence of diplomatic, economic, and strategic actors in a single, neutral setting. Coordination of transport, security, and communications reflects a level of preparation and intent rarely observed outside crisis scenarios. Reports circulating quietly among select circles indicate that the outcomes of these discussions could influence not only political alignments but also broader economic engagements in the region. While the public remains unaware, the mechanisms of negotiation are operating at a scale that, historically, precedes shifts in policy trajectories with global impact. Possibly, it is worth monitoring what transpires next. Some sources are confident this is only the beginning. The day's developments, subtle yet deliberate, suggest a sequence of decisions that could reshape alliances, recalibrate influence, and set precedents for how confidential negotiations are conducted in the modern era. But further clarity remains obscured, and the full picture is still emerging. Analysts emphasize caution in interpretation. The visible movements are just the surface of a deeper, more intricate process unfolding within closed doors. By midday, a clearer picture of the operational framework guiding these secretive talks began to emerge. According to information obtained from sources embedded in multiple diplomatic channels, the hosting arrangements are unusually structured. Delegations have been separated into distinct sectors within the same complex, minimizing incidental contact while allowing for precise scheduling of bilateral and multilateral sessions. Observers note that such segmentation, while seemingly routine, is often employed to prevent informal leaks and to maintain strategic ambiguity. Officially, the host nation has presented this as a standard security measure. In reality, insiders suggest it reflects a layered negotiation strategy, where outcomes are contingent on staged interactions and controlled disclosure. Further analysis indicates that the delegation's composition is highly strategic. Senior negotiators are accompanied by advisors with specialized expertise in finance, energy, and regional security. Sources familiar with the arrangements report that each expert team operates under strict confidentiality protocols, coordinating recommendations in parallel rather than in open forums. In the analytical community, this approach is interpreted as an attempt to isolate influence vectors, ensuring that no single agenda dominates the discourse prematurely. At this stage, official statements remain limited to procedural language, emphasizing diplomatic engagement and adherence to neutrality, but the depth of coordination visible in logistical and personnel deployment hints at the potential for substantive decisions that extend beyond formal announcements. At the same time, communication patterns reveal subtle but significant activity. Certain secure channels, normally reserved for operational updates within international bodies, are transmitting encrypted updates at rates that surpass historical norms. Analysts monitoring these flows have identified distinct bursts corresponding to shifts in the sequence of scheduled meetings, as if signaling preparatory adjustments to accommodate evolving discussion points. Official sources report only that delegates are engaged in routine consultations, yet the data collected from open-source monitoring suggests otherwise. Observers familiar with these signals note that even minor alterations in itinerary or venue assignment can indicate the emergence of sensitive compromise positions, potentially shaping the trajectory of negotiations well before public acknowledgement. The day's unfolding dynamics also reflect an intricate interplay between transparency and discretion. Publicly, the neutral host nation maintains an outwardly calm posture, offering brief statements regarding hospitality and protocol, yet the invisible layers of security, information control, and restricted access reveal a far more complex operation. Analysts point out that this duality is intentional. By projecting routine diplomacy, organizers reduce the likelihood of premature speculation or pressure, while internally, mechanisms are activated to handle multiple contingencies. Sources familiar with the negotiations indicate that the discussions are progressing in modular fashion, with outcomes of one session immediately informing the structure of subsequent sessions. This dynamic allows for rapid recalibration of strategy, ensuring that emerging positions can be refined in real time. Economic considerations appear to play a significant, though understated, role in the ongoing talks. Several participants are reported to have brought detailed analyses on trade dependencies, energy allocations, and financial commitments. While official communiques avoid reference to economic factors, insiders emphasize that the inclusion of these advisors suggests discussions may extend to strategic frameworks with long-term implications for regional markets. Analysts point out that such inclusion is rarely incidental. It signals that any agreements reached could influence not only political alignments but also the underlying economic architecture supporting them. The quiet presence of these technical advisors, working behind the scenes, indicates that preparatory negotiations are actively shaping proposals for both immediate and extended implementation. Meanwhile, intelligence from sources within diplomatic security circles highlights an unusually dense pattern of coordination across multiple jurisdictions. Transportation routes, accommodations, and secure communications are synchronized with precision, an operational complexity rarely seen outside of crisis-level engagements. Analysts observe that this level of orchestration implies high stakes and a recognition that even minor lapses could compromise objectives. Officially, security measures are described as standard precautionary steps, yet insiders emphasize that the scale and attention to detail surpass normal protocols. The resulting tension between visible calm and hidden intensity has led observers to characterize the environment as one of controlled volatility, where each movement is carefully weighed and each communication meticulously filtered. At this juncture, a preliminary pattern emerges. The talks are designed not for public visibility but for operational efficacy, with every step measured against potential strategic shifts. While formal announcements remain deliberately vague, multiple sources confirm that the discussions involve overlapping policy, economic, and security priorities. Analysts note that the day's evolving structure, segmented interactions, carefully timed communications, and adaptive scheduling signals a nuanced approach, reflecting lessons learned from previous high-stakes negotiations. The procedural surface presents an image of routine diplomacy, but beneath, a coordinated effort is unfolding, leveraging intelligence, policy expertise, and tactical discretion to advance agendas that are yet to be disclosed publicly. In expert circles, the current framework is interpreted as both a safeguard and a tool. It prevents leaks, maintains ambiguity, and provides negotiators with the flexibility to respond to real-time developments. While outward appearances suggest stability, internal observers emphasize that the day is operating under conditions of calculated tension, where every decision could have cascading consequences across political and economic domains. Officially, the engagements are described as exploratory discussions. Unofficially, the complexity of coordination, combined with the strategic presence of multiple specialist teams, indicates that the groundwork is being laid for decisions that, if realized, could reshape the region's strategic landscape. The clarity achieved by these insights is partial. Each signal, each procedural nuance, and each movement is indicative, yet the full contours of the agenda remain obscured. Analysts advise close monitoring of subsequent developments, as even minor shifts could reveal the underlying priorities and emerging agreements. Observers are encouraged to note that while the public narrative maintains a veneer of routine diplomacy, the internal mechanics suggest a far more consequential series of negotiations, with implications that may extend well beyond the immediate location. The quiet intensity of the day signals a deliberate orchestration of events, an unfolding story that demands measured attention and careful interpretation. However, by this stage of the day, the apparent calm began to fracture beneath the surface. According to sources close to the coordinating teams, several discussions had already diverged from publicly anticipated topics, moving into areas with high strategic sensitivity. Analysts monitoring encrypted channels report unexpected bursts of activity, coinciding with private meetings between senior envoys whose official agendas do not overlap. On the surface, these interactions appear procedural. Behind closed doors, however, the exchanges are interpreted as preparatory negotiations for contingent agreements that could redefine territorial, political, and economic leverage in the region. Official statements remain deliberately neutral, emphasizing dialogue and cooperation, yet insiders stress that the true substance of these talks is anything but routine. The first hints of these hidden layers emerged when observers noted that specific advisors, previously considered technical support, began exercising influence on negotiation sequencing. Sources indicate that subtle guidance from financial and strategic experts is steering discussions in directions not previously disclosed. In expert circles, this is viewed as an early signal that the talks are evolving into a multidimensional negotiation, where every proposal is assessed not just for political viability but for long-term structural impact. Publicly, all interactions are described as exploratory and consultative. Privately, the dynamics suggest an intricate balancing act, a careful orchestration aimed at reconciling competing interests before outcomes are even announced. It became evident that the scope of the discussions exceeded initial expectations. According to insiders, certain parties are presenting proposals that could shift resource allocation, influence trade corridors, and recalibrate regional power dynamics. Analysts observe that the timing and sequence of these proposals are designed to maintain operational discretion while allowing key stakeholders to evaluate positions incrementally. Officially, all delegations are reported to be engaged in routine consultations on cooperation frameworks. Yet sources warn that this phrasing obscures substantive maneuvering, including potential concessions, conditional agreements, and pre-negotiated fallback positions. The contrast between formal communications and actual operations highlights the complexity of the day. What appears procedural is, in reality, a highly choreographed sequence of strategic interactions. By midday, the internal pivot became clearer. Reports from confidential sources indicate that several delegations are employing contingency-based tactics, adjusting positions in real time based on observed responses from others. Analysts note that these tactics reflect lessons learned from prior high-stakes negotiations, where rigid adherence to public agendas led to missed opportunities or exposure. Within the neutral host country, operational security is coordinated to facilitate this dynamic adjustment, allowing negotiators to act with discretion while preserving plausible deniability in public messaging. Officially, the day's schedule is described as structured and predictable. Unofficially, sources emphasize that flexibility is being exercised at every level, a subtle but powerful form of leverage. The economic dimension of the talks also became more pronounced. Sources report that senior financial advisors are actively integrating macroeconomic data into negotiation strategies, evaluating how proposed agreements might influence regional stability, trade flows, and fiscal resilience. Analysts observing these interactions suggest that such involvement is highly unusual for routine diplomatic consultations and points toward potential agreements with far-reaching economic consequences. Public statements make no reference to these considerations, citing only general discussion of cooperation. Yet insiders stress that these elements are central to the evolving negotiation, with the potential to alter financial and strategic landscapes significantly if implemented. Meanwhile, the interplay between diplomacy and security became increasingly visible, though only to those positioned within monitoring networks. Confidential updates describe coordination between security teams and negotiators to ensure that sensitive information remains contained. Analysts interpret these arrangements as necessary not only for operational control but also as a signal that some proposals carry implications for military and strategic alignments. Officially, security protocols are presented as precautionary measures. Privately, sources confirm that their scope reflects the gravity and potential consequences of the agreements under consideration. By the current hour, a pattern of incremental influence emerges. Advisors, previously acting in the background, are shaping the pace, sequencing, and content of discussions, creating a subtle hierarchy of decision-making. Analysts note that such dynamics are rarely acknowledged publicly, yet they play a critical role in determining outcomes. Official reports frame the day as cooperative, methodical, and procedural. In contrast, sources indicate that every suggestion, adjustment, and counterproposal is part of a strategic calibration, a deliberate exercise in negotiation control designed to produce outcomes favorable to key stakeholders. This internal pivot illuminates a critical aspect: the visible agenda is only the outer layer of a far more intricate negotiation ecosystem. Observers with access to discrete signals report that discussions are continuously influenced by indirect pressure, contingent options, and real-time intelligence. Analysts conclude that the process reflects a duality, outwardly calm and structured, yet internally dynamic and tightly controlled. The contrast between appearance and reality underscores the importance of interpreting procedural cues alongside insider information, a skill essential for understanding how modern high-stakes diplomacy operates under a veil of neutrality. Possibly, it is worth following the unfolding developments closely. Some sources suggest this is the point at which substantive agreements begin to take shape. The day has moved from orchestrated coordination to nuanced negotiation, where unseen levers, hidden contingencies, and carefully timed interventions determine which paths are available and which are foreclosed. The official narrative of routine diplomacy continues, yet the internal evidence points unmistakably to a negotiation of consequence, unfolding quietly but decisively within the secure confines of the host nation. As the day progressed, the initially controlled environment began to exhibit signs of increasing complexity. According to sources embedded within the delegations, the overlapping agendas that had been carefully managed now intersected in ways that required immediate recalibration. Analysts monitoring encrypted communications observed a marked increase in message exchanges between negotiators and advisory teams, suggesting that positions were being adjusted rapidly in response to evolving assessments. Official statements continued to frame the day as orderly, emphasizing dialogue and engagement, but insiders note that the pace of internal decision-making far exceeded normal expectations for routine diplomacy. The subtle tension that had been building now carried the potential to reshape outcomes before they were formally presented. Several signals indicate that the talks are entering a decisive phase. Sources report that previously isolated discussions are beginning to converge, with senior policymakers engaging in back-to-back consultations designed to reconcile divergent positions. Analysts point out that such convergence, though invisible to the public, represents a critical juncture. The balance of influence among stakeholders is being tested, and early indications suggest that contingency planning is driving decision-making more than pre-agreed frameworks. Public communications remain neutral, focusing on cooperation and standard protocols. Privately, however, the intricate alignment of schedules, advisors, and communications reflects a dynamic negotiation environment, where each adjustment carries strategic significance. At this point, economic and security dimensions are increasingly intertwined. Sources familiar with the proceedings describe simultaneous evaluation of political concessions, trade implications, and security assurances. Analysts interpret this integration as indicative of negotiations that extend beyond mere diplomatic symbolism into the realm of enforceable arrangements. Publicly, the narrative remains one of exploratory dialogue, with host nation officials emphasizing neutrality and openness. Behind the scenes, sources stress that the careful sequencing of proposals is shaping not only immediate agreements but also long-term frameworks that could influence regional stability for years. The contrast between official calm and operational intensity underscores the complexity of the day, while the surface suggests routine procedure, the underlying processes are highly consequential. Emerging reports highlight the role of contingency strategies in shaping the day's trajectory. Delegations are said to be employing layered approaches, presenting options sequentially to gauge reactions while maintaining the flexibility to withdraw or modify positions without public acknowledgement. Analysts note that such techniques are rarely visible in official reporting but are standard in negotiations where stakes are elevated and outcomes carry broader ramifications. Security measures, transport logistics, and communication protocols are simultaneously adjusted to accommodate these contingencies, suggesting that the negotiation architecture is designed to absorb rapid shifts without exposing vulnerability. Official statements emphasize process and protocol. Insiders insist that the real story lies in how the frameworks are manipulated in real time to produce calculated leverage. At this stage, observers identify patterns that suggest broader geopolitical ramifications. Sources report that some proposals under discussion involve adjustments to regional resource allocations and economic influence, with potential impacts extending beyond the immediate participants. Analysts highlight that even minor concessions, if implemented, could trigger ripple effects across markets and political alignments. Official messaging maintains a surface-level assurance of continuity, yet the underlying data indicates strategic maneuvering, carefully calibrated to avoid premature disclosure while advancing key interests. The careful orchestration of the day points to a recognition that every procedural move is a signal, every adjustment a test of alignment and readiness. Simultaneously, intelligence indicates heightened engagement by non-official actors influencing internal deliberations. Advisory teams with specialized expertise in finance, energy, and security are reported to be actively shaping discussion priorities. Analysts observing these developments suggest that the day's proceedings are as much about establishing operational consensus among technical experts as they are about political reconciliation. Official accounts obscure this complexity, framing the talks as conventional dialogue. Insider perspectives reveal a multidimensional negotiation environment, where expertise and influence converge to steer outcomes before they become public. By midday, the interplay of these factors creates a heightened operational tempo. Sources report that decision nodes are being tested, positions recalibrated, and proposals iteratively refined. Analysts highlight that the day's trajectory now depends on delicate interactions between contingencies, strategic leverage, and the adaptive responses of participants. Publicly, the host nation presents a composed narrative of engagement. Privately, the environment is dynamic, high-stakes, and precisely coordinated, a rare alignment of factors that could materially influence the direction of future agreements. The unfolding events suggest that the negotiations are at a threshold. According to informed sources, the convergence of political, economic, and strategic considerations is producing pressure points that, if not managed carefully, could lead to sudden shifts in alignment. Analysts caution that the appearance of order should not obscure the underlying volatility. The very structure of the discussions is designed to produce outcomes in real time, balancing multiple competing objectives under a veil of neutrality. Public messaging maintains calm, internal communications reflect calculated urgency. Every movement, every statement, every adjustment carries implications far beyond the immediate setting. However, behind this operational intensity, a broader pattern emerges. Observers report that the day's events are producing emergent alignments and recalibrations of influence. Analysts note that while formal agreements have not yet been disclosed, the architecture of negotiation suggests a trajectory toward conditional arrangements, potentially redefining the relationships among participating parties. Official communications emphasize standard diplomatic engagement. Insider information, in contrast, points to a sophisticated orchestration, a careful balancing act where timing, sequencing, and strategic insight determine the shape of potential settlements. Yet even as the day appears to reach a crescendo of activity, the full scope remains obscured. The official narrative frames discussions as exploratory, with no predetermined outcomes. Insider reports highlight a more intricate reality. Decisions are being influenced by unseen contingencies, expert assessments, and adaptive negotiation tactics, producing a day that is as consequential as it is opaque. Analysts note that this duality, between calm exterior and intensive internal maneuvering, is a hallmark of negotiations with the potential to reshape strategic, economic, and political landscapes simultaneously. The observable events, though significant, are only one layer of a far more complex process. However, behind this procedural facade, an even more complex game is at play. As the day moved toward its midpoint, the quiet intensity of the negotiations settled into a pattern of deliberate pauses and calibrated exchanges. Sources report that the earlier surge of activity gave way to a measured rhythm, where each delegation assessed outcomes, reconsidered positions, and refined proposals. Analysts observing these patterns emphasize that this phase is not a de-escalation but a strategic interlude, allowing participants to consolidate insights and prepare for subsequent engagement. Official statements continue to stress routine diplomacy and procedural normalcy, yet insider accounts underscore that the day's true significance remains hidden beneath layers of discretion and controlled messaging. The subtlety of these developments became increasingly apparent. Confidential sources note that the negotiation framework has evolved to prioritize flexibility over finality, enabling each party to explore contingencies without committing prematurely. Observers highlight that this approach maximizes leverage and preserves the potential for adaptive strategy, reflecting a level of sophistication rarely acknowledged publicly. Public messaging frames the proceedings as cooperative and exploratory. Internally, however, the careful calibration of proposals, counterproposals, and conditional agreements illustrates a negotiation landscape of considerable depth, where every action carries ripple effects across political, economic, and strategic dimensions. Analysts monitoring the day's progression identify emerging patterns of alignment and compromise. Certain positions, once perceived as fixed, have begun to shift subtly, suggesting the influence of indirect channels, expert guidance, and real-time feedback mechanisms. Sources indicate that these adjustments, while invisible in official reports, are shaping potential outcomes in ways that could extend well beyond the immediate context. Observers in expert circles note that the day's dynamics demonstrate a rare convergence of diplomacy, strategy, and technical expertise, producing conditions where even minor decisions may generate long-term impact. Economic and security considerations remain tightly intertwined. Reports from informed sources describe deliberations over trade access, resource distribution, and strategic assurances, with participants carefully weighing potential consequences. Analysts suggest that these discussions are not isolated, rather, they form an integrated framework where political concessions, financial commitments, and security guarantees are interdependent. Official statements emphasize diplomacy and dialogue. Privately, insiders stress that the interconnected nature of these negotiations requires precision, foresight, and a nuanced understanding of how incremental agreements may accumulate to produce significant regional effects. Throughout these hours, the neutral host nation has maintained its posture of calm facilitation. Observers note the contrast between public composure and operational intensity within the negotiation spaces. Coordination of security, communication, and logistical protocols remains meticulous, yet invisible. Analysts interpret this duality as a deliberate mechanism to allow sensitive deliberations to unfold without exposure while sustaining a narrative of routine engagement. The day's progression reflects an underlying logic: every pause, every adjustment, every exchange is calibrated to preserve options, minimize risk, and maximize strategic advantage. By midday, the overall trajectory of the talks indicates incremental but meaningful convergence among parties. Sources emphasize that the discussions are producing conditional understandings, signaling that foundational frameworks may be forming even if formal announcements are not imminent. Analysts observing these developments highlight the delicate interplay of strategy, influence, and timing, noting that the visible surface of diplomacy conceals a complex matrix of negotiation levers and contingency planning. Official communications remain neutral, but internal observers confirm that substantive steps have already been taken, setting the stage for potential long-term arrangements. At this juncture, the day can be understood as both procedural and transformative. Analysts note that while public messaging portrays routine engagement, the internal mechanisms, segmented consultations, adaptive scheduling, and real-time strategic guidance, reveal a process with the capacity to reshape political, economic, and strategic landscapes. Sources indicate that the day's developments, though discrete, are producing signals of alignment, compromise, and forward momentum. Observers emphasize the importance of recognizing these signals, even when formal confirmations are absent, as they reflect the evolving architecture of negotiation outcomes. Yet, despite the meticulous orchestration, the full extent of agreements, positions, and intentions remains obscured. Insiders caution that apparent progress should not be equated with finality. Contingencies, conditional commitments, and adaptive tactics ensure that the negotiation remains fluid. Analysts highlight that understanding the implications requires careful attention to both observed actions and the absence of formal acknowledgement. Publicly, the day may appear composed and orderly, but the underlying dynamics suggest a subtle, ongoing recalibration of influence, priorities, and strategic intent. For observers with access to fragmented signals, the most striking feature of the day is the quiet coordination of complex processes: political, economic, and strategic threads woven together with precision. Analysts note that such integration, largely invisible to external scrutiny, exemplifies how contemporary high-level diplomacy operates under conditions of discretion and strategic ambiguity. The interplay of these elements produces a landscape where outcomes are shaped not by public statements, but by calculated interactions, unseen adjustments, and informed anticipation of stakeholder responses. On the surface, the negotiations appear contained within a neutral setting, proceeding without incident. Behind the scenes, however, the mechanisms of influence, decision-making, and contingency planning continue to operate with intensity and deliberation. Analysts suggest that the day may mark the beginning of a new phase, one where conditional agreements, strategic alignment, and subtle shifts in leverage could produce tangible outcomes over time. Public communications remain deliberately neutral. Internal observers emphasize that the operational reality is far more consequential. At this moment, the narrative of routine diplomacy coexists with a far more intricate reality, negotiations of substance unfolding in real time, influenced by expertise, strategy, and adaptive decision-making. Analysts conclude that the day has established foundational trajectories whose ultimate resolution may not yet be visible. The full impact remains emergent, and observers are advised to remain attentive to subsequent signals. On the surface, everything may appear resolved. But those who track the subtle interplay of diplomacy, strategy, and influence know this is only the beginning of a complex and ongoing process.